I thought the most terrifying sound on earth was a gunshot. I was wrong. It is the sound of the man you have loved for 8 years, clearing his throat on a police recording, rehearsing perfectly staged lies while your mother bleeds on her kitchen floor. I walked into that station ready to clear up a terrible misunderstanding. Instead, a trembling detective just pressed play and begged me to listen. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our monetization features, leaving us without the budget to keep our operations running. If you find today's story captivating, please support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can listen to exclusive, true stories that are even more incredible, much longer, and describe detailed situations we cannot make public on YouTube, all featuring multiple emotional voice actors. You can join by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the Patreon link in the description or comments of this video. Now, let us dive into today's story, told from the perspective of our main character, Aaliyah Murray. The biting cold of a Colorado winter night has a way of sinking straight into your bones. I was 34 years old, working the graveyard shift as the risk coordination manager at Vanguard Horizon Logistics, a highly secured, closed-circuit private transport company. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed a steady, numb rhythm. My shift was finally winding down. I was just packing up my laptop when my phone vibrated violently against the metal desk. The glowing screen read 2:15 in the morning. The caller identification showed my mother's name, Beatrice. My mother was 68 years old, a fiercely independent and sharp-minded former accountant living in the quiet suburbs of Oak Haven County. She never called after 9 at night unless someone was dead or dying. My stomach plummeted. I snatched the phone and pressed it to my ear, expecting her familiar no-nonsense tone. Instead, a heavy, ragged breathing filled the speaker. It was not my mother. It was Julian, my husband. I had to defend myself, he said. His voice was not panicked. It was terrifyingly flat and sharp, slicing through the static. Your mother lunged at me with a knife. The police are taking her away right now. My heart stopped dead in my chest. The world around me tilted. Julian was a successful, charming, and impossibly calm real estate developer. In all our years together, I had never seen him raise his voice, let alone a hand. The idea of him involved in a violent altercation was absurd. But the idea of my mother, a woman who calculated her grocery budget to the exact penny and spent her weekends gardening, attacking someone with a knife, that was utter insanity. Julian, what are you talking about? Where is she? I yelled into the receiver, but the line went dead. Panic, pure and primal, took over. I abandoned my bags, sprinted down the echoing hallway, and shoved open the heavy glass doors. The freezing Oak Haven air hit my face like a physical blow, but I barely felt it. I practically threw myself into my car, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, tearing out of the parking lot with a sickening screech of tires. The drive to the Oak Haven County Police Station usually took 25 minutes. I was determined to make it in 15. The dark, icy roads blurred past my windshield as my mind became a war zone. I was violently torn between two impossible realities. On one side was my aging, fragile mother. On the other was my model husband. How did Julian even end up at her house in the middle of the night? Suddenly, the interior of my car flashed with a harsh blue light. My phone, sitting on the passenger seat, buzzed. Then it buzzed again, and again. Julian was bombarding me with text messages. I grabbed the phone with a shaking hand, keeping one eye on the treacherous road. She just snapped. Aaliyah, I swear I just went over to drop off those tax documents she asked for. Another message popped up. I tried to calm her down, but she was completely out of her mind. The doctors warned us this could happen with people her age. And then another. I am the victim here, honey. She is senile and dangerous. You have to believe me before the police start spinning stories. He was relentless. As I flew down the empty highway, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, The relentless pinging of my phone felt less like an explanation and more like a calculated assault. He was desperately trying to mold the narrative, planting seeds of doubt in my head, framing my brilliant mother as a crazed, dementia-riddled old woman before I could even look her in the eyes. He wanted me to walk into that police station completely brainwashed. He almost succeeded. Exactly 18 minutes after the phone call, I slammed my shoulder against the heavy glass doors of the Oak Haven County Police Precinct. I had braced myself for absolute chaos. During the chaotic drive over, I expected to walk into a storm of angry deputies, the clinking of handcuffs, and the glaring hostility usually reserved for the family members of a violent perpetrator. Instead, the precinct was suffocatingly quiet. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a sickening pale yellow hue over the polished linoleum floor. The smell of cheap floor wax and stale coffee hung heavy in the air. A few uniformed officers glanced up from their paperwork as I burst inside, but their eyes held no malice or aggression. They looked away quickly, shifting in their chairs. The silence was entirely wrong. It felt less like a busy county precinct and more like a morgue waiting for a body. I frantically scanned the main lobby, desperately looking for the holding cells or the temporary medical bay. Before I could take another step toward the front desk, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a wrinkled trench coat stepped directly into my path. It was the chief detective. I recognized his deeply lined face from local news briefings I had seen on television, though tonight, the harsh lines around his mouth were softened by something that looked disturbingly like pity. I opened my mouth to demand to see my mother, ready to shout and defend her against whatever insane, fabricated charges Julian had fed to them. The detective raised a thick, calloused hand gently, cutting me off before a single syllable could escape my throat. He did not ask for my identification. He did not pull out a standard issue notepad to interrogate me about my mother's mental state. He simply looked at me with an expression of profound sorrow and gestured toward a thick, soundproof door down the narrow hallway. "Please, Mrs. Murray," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come with me to the investigation room. There is something you need to hear before you see her." I followed him, my legs suddenly feeling like they were cast in solid lead. The investigation room was cramped, freezing cold, and smelled faintly of ozone and old sweat. Sitting perfectly center on the scratched metal interrogation table was a smartwatch. Its cracked glass screen reflected the harsh glare of the single overhead bulb. I recognized the scuffed brown leather strap instantly. It was my mother's watch, the one I had purchased for her 65th birthday to help track her heart rate during her morning walks. The detective sat down heavily across from me and carefully plugged a small data cable from the watch into his secure laptop. He explained that during the violent struggle in the kitchen, the emergency recording mode had been triggered automatically by a sudden, massive spike in her pulse combined with a hard physical impact to the device. Julian had absolutely no idea the microphone was active. The tiny piece of technology had captured exactly what happened in that house. The detective hesitated for a fraction of a second, his index finger hovering over the mouse pad. "I am so incredibly sorry to make you listen to this," he murmured, and then he pressed play. I gripped the edges of the metal table, bracing myself for the sound of my mother shouting in a dementia-induced rage, perhaps the clatter of a dropped kitchen knife on the tile. Anything that could remotely justify the frantic victim narrative in the text messages currently sitting in my coat pocket. But there was no shouting. There was no frantic scuffle of a woman losing her mind. There was only the hauntingly cheerful sound of a man whistling. I knew that tune intimately. It was a classic jazz melody Julian always whistled when he was cooking our Sunday breakfasts. My blood ran completely cold. The casual whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by a sickening, heavy thud. It was the unmistakable sound of a blunt object striking human flesh and bone with extreme force. A sharp, wet gasp tore through the audio speakers, followed by the agonizing sound of someone choking on their own breath. It was my mother. Then came the voice. It was not panicked. It was not the voice of a man defending his own life. It was the cold, methodical, and utterly ruthless voice of the man I slept next to every single night. Sign the power of attorney, or you will not make it through the night, the voice hissed, the words dripping with venom. The silence that followed the end of the recording was deafening. My lungs completely forgot how to pull in oxygen. The detective closed the laptop with a soft click. He leaned forward, his voice low, urgent, and strictly professional. He told me that Julian was currently sitting in a holding cell just 2 doors down the hall, sipping bottled water and playing the part of the traumatized, heartbroken victim flawlessly. Julian had even managed to produce a shallow, strategic scratch on his own forearm to support his self-defense claim. But the police knew the horrifying truth now. The problem was, a high-priced defense lawyer could easily argue in court that the audio was garbled, or they could contest the identity of the speaker on the tape. The police needed me. They needed the wife to officially and legally identify the voice on the recording and confirm the malicious intent behind those specific words to completely flip the board on him. I stared at the blank laptop screen, a freezing, hardening rage crystallizing deep inside my chest. I nodded slowly, giving them the exact verbal confirmation they needed to destroy his alibi. Once the official statement was signed, the detective escorted me down the corridor to the medical wing. I pushed open the heavy white door and saw her. My mother looked impossibly fragile lying on the narrow, stiff cot. A dark purple contusion covered the entire left side of her face, and the attending doctor whispered to me that she had sustained 3 cracked ribs and severe internal bruising. But when I stepped closer to the bed, her eyes snapped open. There was absolutely no fear in them. There was no confusion or senility. Despite the brutal physical beating she had just endured, her gaze was as sharp, lucid, and calculating as ever. I reached out to hold her bruised, trembling hand, tears finally threatening to spill over my lower eyelids. She squeezed my fingers with a shocking amount of strength. She did not cry. She did not ask why Julian had done this. She simply pulled my hand, forcing me to lean down closer to her battered face until I could feel her ragged, warm breath against my ear. She forced out 6 single words, her voice barely a rasp in the quiet room. Safe number 4 at the bank. The hardest role I have ever had to play in my entire life began the moment Julian walked out of those precinct doors on temporary bail. The district attorney had agreed to release him while they built a bulletproof case, and the chief detective and I had a mutual understanding. If we arrested him now, his high-priced lawyers would tear the smartwatch recording apart in court. They would claim it was illegally obtained, or that the audio was distorted, or that my mother had provoked him first, to lock him away forever. I had to become the perfect, naive, bewildered wife. I had to swallow the agonizing urge to wrap my hands around his throat and instead wrap my arms around his shoulders. When I picked him up, he pulled me into a tight embrace. He smelled like sterile police station soap and his expensive cedar cologne. It made me physically nauseous, but I forced myself to bury my face in his chest and cry softly. I told him I was so confused, that I did not understand what was happening, and that I was completely overwhelmed. He stroked my hair, playing the role of the benevolent, wrongfully accused protector flawlessly. He told me everything was going to be all right, that my mother was simply losing her mind, and that we would get through this tragedy together. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. If I had not heard that recording with my own 2 ears, I would have believed every single word dripping from his mouth. Almost immediately, Julian launched a ruthless, scorched earth smear campaign against a 68-year-old woman lying broken in a hospital bed. He moved with a terrifying efficiency. By the very next morning, he had retained one of the most aggressive defense attorneys in the state. Then, the social assassination began. Julian started making phone calls to our mutual friends, our neighbors, and even members of our extended family. I sat on the living room sofa, pretending to sip my tea, while I listened to him spin a perfectly crafted web of lies. His voice was always laced with the exact right amount of sorrow and heavy burden. "It is just heartbreaking," I heard him say to our next-door neighbor over the fence. "Beatrice has been slipping for months. The doctors warned us about this kind of severe senile paranoia. She just snapped, grabbed a knife, and started swinging. I tried to hold her back, and she ended up thrashing around and falling against the kitchen island. I am just glad she did not kill herself, or me, before the police arrived. He was painting her as a tragic monster and himself as the merciful victim. He controlled the narrative so tightly that within 48 hours, our entire social circle was sending him sympathy cards and offering him emotional support. No one questioned the charming, successful real estate developer. They all bought into the tragedy of the aging, delusional mother-in-law. The violence of his mental abuse was suffocating. Every time he looked at me with those sad, empathetic eyes, asking if I was holding up okay. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled to keep from screaming. But the psychological torture was only the first layer of his strategy. The financial strangulation came next. 3 days after the assault, I went to pay for my mother's private medical care. She needed specialized treatment for her fractured ribs and the internal bleeding. When I handed the receptionist my primary bank card, it was declined. I tried a second joint credit card. Declined. My blood ran cold. I immediately logged into our shared banking portal on my phone, only to find that every single joint account, savings fund, and shared credit line we possessed had been completely frozen. When I confronted Julian in the kitchen, feigning panic, he offered me a tight, sympathetic smile. He explained that his lawyer had advised him to temporarily freeze all shared assets. He claimed it was a standard legal precaution to protect our finances from potential civil lawsuits, just in case my mother's delusions led her to sue him for her self-inflicted injuries. It was a brilliantly evil move. By freezing the accounts, he cut off the vital stream of private medical funding my mother desperately needed. "We just cannot afford that luxury private wing right now, honey," Julian said softly, placing a warm hand on my trembling shoulder. "There is a perfectly good state-run nursing care facility on the east side of the county. It is much more affordable, and they specialize in severe psychiatric decline. It is exactly where she belongs now." He was trying to force her into a cheap, underfunded, and heavily medicated facility where her sharp mind would be dulled by sedatives and her voice would never be heard. He wanted her locked away and discredited forever. I looked down at the floor, forcing my voice to shake, and told him I would look into the state facility. He kissed my forehead, completely satisfied that his obedient wife was broken and compliant. He had no idea who he was actually dealing with. Julian thought my job at Vanguard Horizon Logistics was just pushing papers and managing corporate schedules. He severely underestimated the capabilities of a risk coordination manager at a private, closed-circuit logistics firm. My entire career was built on identifying anomalies, tracing hidden liabilities, and predicting catastrophic failures before they happened. I had unrestricted access to some of the most sophisticated financial tracking software and deep web database analyzers in the corporate sector. That night, while Julian slept soundly in our bed, confident in his absolute control, I logged into my secured work terminal from my home office. I started running his name, his social security number, and his known corporate entities through our global risk assessment network. I was looking for the motive. I assumed he was drowning in secret debt, perhaps ruined by a bad real estate gamble, and needed to take control of my mother's assets to bail himself out. I spent 6 hours tearing through digital firewalls, tracing shell companies, and following encrypted wire transfers across state lines. What I found was infinitely worse than bankruptcy. Julian was not broke. He was swimming in liquid cash, but none of it was attached to the name Julian, buried deep beneath 3 layers of corporate shielding. I uncovered an entirely separate identity, an alias complete with a pristine credit history, a secondary social security number, and a residential address 200 miles away in a neighboring state. My hands shook as I pulled up the public records associated with that phantom identity. The screen illuminated a marriage certificate dated 3 years ago. The groom was Julian, using his alternate name. The bride was a woman I had never seen before in my life. He was leading a complete double life. He had a fake wife, a fake home, and a massive portfolio of life insurance policies and fraudulent real estate mortgages tied to that false identity. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. This was never about a random argument in a kitchen. This was a highly calculated, long-term financial assassination. My family owned a sprawling plot of undeveloped commercial land just outside the city limits, an inheritance my mother and I shared. A recent municipal rezoning had quietly bumped the value of that property to nearly $4 million. Julian knew this. He had been planning this for years. The violent assault, the smartwatch recording, the power of attorney, it all made perfect, terrifying sense. The document he had tried to force my bleeding mother to sign that night was not a medical proxy. It was a complete surrender of her property rights. Getting her signature was the absolute final step he needed. With that power of attorney, Julian would have the legal authority to instantly liquidate the $4 million estate. He would transfer the cash into his offshore shell accounts, abandon his life with me, and vanish into his second identity with his new wife, leaving me completely destitute and my mother rotting in a psychiatric ward. He was not just a manipulative abuser, he was a professional predator, and he thought he had already won. As I stared at the digital copies of his fake marriage license and the fraudulent mortgage applications, the suffocating disguise of the confused, heartbroken wife melted away entirely. The agonizing urge to cry was completely replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity. Julian had spent 8 years building this intricate, perfect lie to destroy my family. I was going to use his own arrogance to burn his entire world to the ground. The heavy steel door of the First National Bank vault swung open with a hollow thud. The manager led me down the brightly lit corridor. I handed him the brass key my mother had slipped into my pocket. We stopped in front of a small square door engraved with the number 4. With a synchronized twist of our keys, the metal drawer slid free. I carried the steel box into a private viewing room, locking the door behind me. Inside, there was no cash or jewelry. There was only a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope. I tore it open, pulling out a stack of glossy photographs and a densely typed 50-page report. My mother had known something was wrong for months. The report was from a high-end private investigator she had quietly retained in October. The photos documented every detail of Julian and his alternate life. There were pictures of him walking a dog 200 miles away. There were images of him kissing his fake wife on the porch of a suburban home. The investigator had even secured a physical copy of his fraudulent marriage certificate and the forged loan documents used for his mortgage. My mother had built an airtight case against him. She had the absolute proof of his financial fraud. That was exactly why he had attacked her. He realized she was closing in, and he needed her silenced before she could hand this envelope over to the authorities. She was not a confused old woman. She was a brilliant tactician who had cornered a predator, and he had tried to slaughter her for it. I placed the documents back into the box. I had the motive and the proof, but my mind shifted to the brutal reality of the justice system. The smartwatch audio was a massive liability. Julian had hired a shark of an attorney who would argue the recording was obtained illegally without two-party consent. They would claim it was inadmissible in a court of law. If a judge threw that audio out, Julian could potentially beat the attempted murder charge. He would go to prison for the financial crimes. But he would eventually get out. That was unacceptable. I needed him locked away for the rest of his natural life. To achieve that, I needed a voluntary, irrefutable confession. I needed him to admit exactly what he did, out loud, on a legally sanctioned recording. It was time to play my final card. When I returned to our shared home that evening, I made sure my eyes were bloodshot and my posture was completely defeated. I found Julian sitting in the living room, comfortably sipping bourbon, looking like a man without a single care. I collapsed onto the sofa across from him, burying my face in my hands, and let out an agonizing sob. "I cannot do this anymore. Julian," I cried, letting my voice crack with perfectly calculated exhaustion. "You were right. The doctors said her mind is completely gone. She does not even recognize me half the time. The legal bills, the stress, it is tearing me apart. I am so tired." Julian set his glass down and moved to sit beside me. He wrapped his arms around my shaking frame, pulling me against his chest. "Shh, it is okay, honey," he whispered with synthetic sympathy. "I told you I would handle everything. We will get her the psychiatric help she needs." I nodded weakly. "I will sign the papers tomorrow, the asset transfer, the medical proxy, all of it. But I need to go to her house tonight to pack up some of her clothes for the state facility. Please, meet me there at 8 o'clock. Bring the power of attorney documents. Let us just settle everything once and for all, together." I could feel the subtle shift in his body language. His muscles relaxed. He took a satisfied breath. He had won. The irritating mother-in-law was neutralized, and the broken wife was handing him the keys to a $4 million kingdom. "I will be there, sweetheart," he promised softly. 2 hours later, I pulled into the driveway of my mother's dark house, but I was not alone. The chief detective and 3 highly trained technicians from the State Bureau of Investigation were waiting by the back door. We had secured an emergency, expedited warrant from a superior court judge based on the investigator file I retrieved. The house was now legally classified as an active sting operation. The technicians moved with absolute, silent precision. They wired the entire kitchen, the exact location of the original assault. They installed a microcamera inside the plastic housing of the ceiling smoke detector. They placed a high-definition lens behind the decorative books on the top pantry shelf. They threaded tiny, hypersensitive microphones behind the refrigerator grill and underneath the lip of the granite kitchen island. Every single square inch of that room was now covered by synchronized, court-approved audio and video recording equipment. When the technicians packed up their hard cases and slipped out the back door, the chief detective gave me a firm nod before retreating to the surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. I stood entirely alone in the center of the kitchen. The harsh overhead lights illuminated a faint, dark stain on the white tile floor near the oven. It was my mother's blood. Julian had missed a spot when he tried to clean up his crime scene. I stared at that dark crimson smudge, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. The mousetrap was perfectly set. The steel jaws were pulled back, and the rat was currently driving across town, completely eager to take the cheese. Exactly at 8 o'clock, the heavy rumble of Julian's luxury sedan echoed up the driveway. I heard the solid thud of the car door closing, followed by the rhythmic, unhurried crunch of his expensive leather shoes against the gravel walkway. The kitchen door swung open, and Julian stepped inside. He did not look like a man burdened by tragedy or a looming criminal investigation. He radiated the smug, suffocating aura of a conqueror who had just won a war. He was dressed flawlessly in a tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. He smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of his lips, and tossed a thick stack of legal documents right onto the center of the granite kitchen island. The papers landed less than 2 inches away from the dark crimson smear of my mother's blood that he had failed to scrub from the tile. "I have everything right here, sweetheart," Julian said smoothly, sliding a heavy gold fountain pen across the smooth stone surface toward me. "The medical proxy, the asset management transfer, and the total power of attorney. All you have to do is sign on the dotted lines, and this entire nightmare will finally be over for both of us. We can move on with our lives." I picked up the pen. I forced my hand to tremble violently, letting the gold casing tap erratically against the granite countertop. I stared down at the documents, then let my eyes drift slowly toward the bloodstain on the floor. I let out a jagged, hyperventilating breath, playing the role of a woman whose spirit was entirely shattered. "I just do not understand," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "I am going to sign it. Julian, I promise I am, but my mind is just racing. I cannot stop thinking about it." Julian sighed dramatically, leaning his perfectly tailored elbows against the counter. "Thinking about what? Aaliyah, we are fixing this. You need to focus." I looked up at him, widening my bloodshot eyes, and delivered the bait with surgical precision. "I am just in absolute awe of you," I murmured, lacing my voice with submissive wonder. "They are professionals. The detectives, the crime scene units, the entire American justice system. They tear people apart for a living. How did you manage to fool all of them? How did you outsmart the entire police force without leaving a single trace? It was the perfect strike against a malignant narcissist. His ego was a massive, fragile balloon, and I had just handed him the needle. A normal criminal would have told me to shut up and sign the papers, but Julian could not resist. The urge to brag about his own dark brilliance, to bask in his twisted superiority, was completely overpowering. Julian let out a low, arrogant chuckle. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest as a sickeningly proud grin spread across his face. "They are not geniuses, Aaliyah," he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt for the authorities. "They just look at the obvious picture painted for them. It is all about preparation. I knew exactly what I was doing. I parked 3 blocks away, completely out of sight of those neighborhood security cameras. I wore surgical gloves under my leather driving gloves, so I would not leave a single fingerprint on anything other than the knife I forced into her hand." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with malicious excitement as he recounted his masterpiece. "When the old witch refused to sign the property transfer, I grabbed that heavy iron paperweight from her desk. I swung it as hard as I could. She went down like a sack of bricks. But the real stroke of genius was the knife. I placed her kitchen knife in her hand, wrapped my own fingers around the handle, and sliced my forearm open. I bled all over the floor right next to her. By the time the police arrived, I was crying on the phone, bleeding out, and she was the violent aggressor. It was a flawless execution of self-defense." He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and foul. "Now," he growled, the charming facade instantly vaporizing into pure, unadulterated menace. "Stop asking stupid questions. Pick up the pen. Sign the damn papers. Or I swear to God I will make sure you end up in a hospital bed right next to that decrepit mother of yours." I stopped shaking. I set the gold pen down on the granite counter with a sharp, definitive click. I looked him dead in the eyes and smiled. "No," I said, my voice entirely steady. Julian blinked, confusion flashing across his arrogant features for a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth to scream at me, raising his hand to strike. He never got the chance. A deafening explosion of shattering glass tore through the kitchen. The massive bay windows facing the backyard completely exploded inward in a shower of brilliant shards. Simultaneously, the solid oak front door was kicked off its hinges with an ear-splitting crack. A heavily armed tactical police unit flooded into the room from every conceivable angle. Brilliant white tactical flashlights blinded us, slicing through the air alongside the terrifying red dots of laser sights painting Julian's chest. "Police, get down on the ground right now. Show me your hands." A dozen overlapping, commanding voices roared. Julian shrieked in absolute terror. Throwing his hands over his head and dropping to his knees so hard, I heard the bones crack against the tile. 2 massive tactical officers slammed him face first onto the ground, right on top of my mother's bloodstain, and viciously wrenched his arms behind his back. The heavy ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking into place echoed through the chaotic room. The chief detective strolled through the broken front doorway, stepping over the splintered wood. He held a secure audio receiver in his hand, a grim smirk on his face. But he was not alone. 2 uniformed deputies walked in right behind him. Handcuffed between them was a woman with blonde hair, weeping uncontrollably. I recognized her instantly from the private investigator's photographs. It was Julian's fake wife. Julian wrenched his neck upward, his cheek still mashed against the cold tile. When his eyes locked onto the blonde woman, all the color drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of chalk white. "You lied to me," the blonde woman screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage as she thrashed against the deputies holding her arms. "You told me you were finalizing the divorce. You told me we were moving to Europe. You promised me you were going to throw her off the balcony on your vacation next week, so we could take the $4 million. The room went dead silent. Even the tactical officers paused. The air was completely sucked out of my lungs. He was not just planning to leave me destitute, he had meticulously planned to murder me within 7 days. Julian looked wildly from the weeping blonde woman to the chief detective holding the recording device, and finally up to me. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic, trembling creature thrashing on the floor. His arrogant empire of lies had completely imploded. There were hidden cameras in the ceiling, a crystal-clear recorded confession echoing on police servers, his fraudulent accomplice screaming his murder plot out loud, and a dozen armed witnesses standing in the room. The predator was finally caught in the trap, and his face twisted into an expression of absolute, suffocating horror as he realized he was never going to see the outside of a prison cell again. The criminal trial was incredibly swift, lacking any of the dramatic suspense Julian had likely envisioned. Faced with the crystal-clear audio and video recordings captured by the hidden kitchen cameras, along with the explosive, desperate testimony of his fraudulent wife, Julian's high-priced defense attorney had absolutely nothing to work with. It took the jury less than 3 hours of deliberation to return a guilty verdict on every single count. The presiding judge showed zero mercy, looking down from the bench with total disgust before sentencing him to 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for severe aggravated assault, massive financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. His meticulously crafted empire of lies crumbled into dust overnight. The exact same friends and neighbors who had rushed to defend him on social media, those who had sent him sympathy cards and casseroles, quickly deleted their posts and turned their backs completely. They were utterly sickened by the monster they had unknowingly supported. Julian became a total pariah, permanently erased and shunned from the society he had tried to manipulate so effortlessly. My mother's physical recovery was a true testament to her unbreakable spirit. When the day finally came for her to testify in court, she did not walk into that room as a fragile, broken victim. She strode up to the witness stand with her head held high, looking directly into Julian's terrified eyes without a single ounce of fear or hesitation. Her testimony was razor-sharp, articulate, and completely devastating to his defense. She proved to the entire courtroom that the mind of a 68-year-old woman was vastly superior to the cheap, dirty parlor tricks of a predatory narcissist. In the aftermath of the sentencing, I aggressively liquidated every single joint asset Julian and I had ever shared. I sold his luxury cars, the house we lived in, and emptied the remaining legitimate bank accounts. I took a significant portion of that money and quietly donated it to a national foundation dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence and severe psychological abuse escape and rebuild their lives. Now, I stand on the sunlit back porch of the beautiful new home my mother and I purchased together. The morning air is crisp, and the world around me is finally quiet. I take a slow, warm sip of my coffee, letting the profound peacefulness wash over me. I have learned the hard way that blind trust should never be handed over simply because someone speaks with sweet, comforting words. True strength is found in the quiet, calculating depths of survival. And I finally understand that the absolute sweetest form of revenge is not violence. It is systematically stripping away every ounce of power from a man who genuinely believed he held the power of life and death in his hands. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's story compelling and wish to support us, please consider joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our absolute best exclusive, true stories that are simply too intense to make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment.